My daughter-in-law laughed at my work boots at the country club. By dinner, everyone in that same room knew my name, but by then I had already learned something far more important than whether strangers respected me. "Bill," Lauren said loud enough for half the patio to hear, "did you seriously wear those boots here?" A few people turned toward me before I even looked up from my coffee. Someone chuckled. Another man lowered his newspaper just enough to get a better look at the old leather boots resting beneath my chair. "Construction boots," Lauren continued with a smile that never reached her eyes. I guess dress shoes were too much to ask. I wrapped both hands around my warm coffee mug and watched a thin curl of steam disappear into the cool Montana morning. I didn't answer her. I simply took another sip. Sometimes silence weighs more than words, though very few people understand that while they're busy laughing, what happened over the next few hours changed more than one reputation. And if this story speaks to your heart, I'd be honored if you stayed with me until the very end. Tell me the city or country you're watching from, and let me know your local time as you're listening. I always enjoy knowing how far a single story can travel. My name is William Carter, though everyone has called me Bill for as long as I can remember. I'm 68 years old, and the morning I'm about to tell you about forever changed the way I looked at family, respect, and the quiet value of an honest life. At the time, I believed the deepest pain came from strangers judging you. I was wrong. The deepest pain comes when your own family joins them. So come with me to that Saturday morning, because what looked like a simple insult over an old pair of boots was only the beginning of something none of us saw coming. It had been nearly 5 years since I retired from full-time work. Retirement sounded peaceful when people talked about it, but real retirement mostly meant slower mornings, longer walks, and finding reasons not to feel lonely after the house grew too quiet. My wife, Helen, had passed away 3 winters earlier. The silence she left behind settled into every room like dust. Some mornings I still reached for a second coffee mug before remembering there was no one waiting at the kitchen table anymore. That Saturday started like most others. I woke before sunrise, fed the birds outside my porch, and polished my old pickup truck even though it barely needed it. The work boots Lauren hated so much sat beside the front door exactly where I'd left them the evening before. They weren't fashionable. The leather was cracked in places. The soles had been replaced twice, but they'd carried me through more years than I could count. I slipped them on without thinking. Around 8 o'clock, my son Michael called. "Morning, Dad." "Morning, son. Don't forget brunch at the club." Lauren reserved a table. I smiled. "I remember." He hesitated. "You know how she is." "I know exactly how she is." Another pause. Maybe wear something a little nicer?" I looked down at my jeans and flannel shirt. "These are nice." He let out a tired laugh that sounded more nervous than amused. "I just don't want today turning awkward." "Neither do I." We ended the call politely, but something about his voice stayed with me during the drive into town. Michael had become a man who apologized before problems even happened. I wasn't sure whether he was trying to protect me or protect the life he had built with Lauren. Maybe both. The country club sat on a hill overlooking the valley outside Bozeman. The grass looked freshly trimmed, and small American flags lined the entrance because the club was hosting its annual community fundraiser later that evening. Luxury cars filled the parking lot. My dusty pickup looked out of place among them, but trucks had never embarrassed me. Honest work never embarrassed me. Inside the clubhouse, the smell of fresh pastries mixed with expensive cologne. Members greeted one another by first name. Golf bags rolled across polished floors. Waitresses moved quietly between white linen tables carrying silver coffee pots. Michael waved when he spotted me. "Dad, over here." Emma jumped out of her chair before I even reached the table. "Grandpa!" She wrapped her arms around my waist without caring what boots I wore. "You came? Wouldn't miss seeing my favorite girl." She grinned. "I'm your only granddaughter. That certainly makes choosing easier." Lauren barely looked up from her phone. "Good morning," she said flatly. "Morning, Lauren." Her eyes drifted downward. I saw the exact moment she noticed my boots. Her smile appeared slowly, almost thoughtfully, like she'd just discovered something amusing. "Bill," she said, "those can't seriously be the shoes you plan to wear all day." Michael shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Lauren." "What?" she replied. "I'm just asking." I pulled out my chair and sat down. They're comfortable. They're work boots. She laughed softly. We're at the country club. Emma looked from her mother to me. Grandpa always wears those. Lauren brushed a loose strand of blonde hair behind her ear. Sweetheart, that's exactly my point. A nearby couple glanced toward our table. One whispered something that made the other smile. I reached for the coffee the waiter had just poured. It smelled rich and strong, exactly the way I liked it. Bill, Lauren continued, lowering her voice only slightly. People notice these things. I nodded. They usually do. I'm serious. So am I, she sighed dramatically. Sometimes I wish you'd care a little more about appearances. Before I could answer, an older gentleman walked past our table and slowed for just a second. He looked directly at me, not at my boots, at my face. His expression shifted into something I couldn't quite place. Recognition, maybe, or surprise. He frowned slightly as though trying to remember where we'd met before. Then someone called his name from across the room, and he continued walking without saying a word. I watched him disappear into the dining hall while an uneasy feeling settled quietly in the back of my mind. Somehow, I had the unmistakable sense that this day wasn't going to unfold the way anyone at our table expected. I kept thinking about the man who had looked at me for those brief few seconds before walking away. There had been something familiar in his eyes, but I could not place him. And before I had time to think much more about it, Emma tugged gently on my sleeve. "Grandpa, can you come see the koi pond with me after breakfast?" she asked. I heard they added baby fish. I smiled. I would like that very much. Lauren looked up from unfolding her linen napkin. "Emma, let Grandpa finish eating first." Her tone sounded polite enough for anyone listening nearby, but I had learned over the years that there was often another meaning hidden underneath her words. Michael cleared his throat. "Dad, they renovated the west patio last month. It looks really nice." "I remember when there was nothing there but gravel," I said. "That whole hill used to flood every spring." Lauren laughed quietly. "That was a long time ago." "Yes," I answered. "It was." She returned to her menu without another word, but her expression carried the same familiar look I had seen more times than I cared to count. It was not hatred. Hatred would have at least required emotion. It was dismissal, as though everything that belonged to my generation had quietly expired. Sitting there with my coffee warming my hands, I realized this morning was only another page in a story that had begun years earlier. When Michael first introduced Lauren to me, she had been warm, charming, and full of questions. She asked about my workshop. She admired the vegetable garden Helen loved so much. She laughed at my stories about raising Michael. "I always wanted a father like you," she had once told me while we were planting tomatoes in my backyard. I believed her. Maybe she even believed herself back then. People change slowly. It almost never happens in a single moment. It happens conversation by conversation, success by success, dinner by dinner, until one day you wake up and realize the person sitting across the table no longer sees you at all. The first small change came after Michael made partner at his law firm. Their circle of friends changed. Weekends became charity galas, wine tastings, golf tournaments, and dinner parties where everyone seemed to know which fork belonged with which course. None of those things bothered me. I had spent 40 years around concrete, lumber, blueprints, and men whose hands looked just like mine. Fancy rooms never impressed me. Honest people always did. One evening they invited me over for dinner shortly after moving into their new home. I arrived carrying a homemade apple pie. Lauren opened the door, smiled politely, then glanced behind me. "Oh," she said, "you drove the truck. It still runs. The neighbors are having guests tonight." I looked toward the street. Should I park somewhere else? Maybe around the corner? She smiled again, but I could tell she was relieved when I moved the truck out of sight. At dinner, one of Michael's coworkers asked what I had done before retiring. Before I could answer, Lauren spoke first. Bill worked construction most of his life. There was nothing technically wrong with her sentence, but somehow she made it sound as though I had barely managed to survive instead of building a career I had been proud of. I smiled anyway. "Construction gave me a good life." The man nodded respectfully. "That is honest work." Lauren changed the subject almost immediately. Driving home that night, I wondered why her words bothered me so much. She had not lied. She had simply reduced an entire lifetime into two ordinary words: construction worker. She never mentioned the apprentices I trained, the scholarships our company quietly funded, the employees who bought their first homes because they stayed with us for 20 years. None of that seemed to matter anymore. After Helen died, the distance grew wider. The holidays became shorter. Invitations arrived later. Sometimes they did not arrive at all until Emma secretly called me herself. "Grandpa," she whispered once over the telephone, "Mom forgot to invite you for Thanksgiving. Can I tell Dad?" I laughed softly so she would not hear the ache in my chest. "No, sweetheart. Your father has enough on his mind. But I want you there. Then I will be there." Michael called 30 minutes later, sounding embarrassed. "Dad, I thought Lauren already invited you." "Do not worry about it. I am sorry. I know you are." He apologized often. Too often. Eventually, apologies become another way of accepting that nothing will change. Helen used to notice these things before I did. One evening, months before she became sick, we sat together on our back porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. She rested her head against my shoulder and asked quietly, "Do you ever feel invisible?" I turned toward her. "Why would you ask that?" She smiled sadly. "Because sometimes people only notice what we can give them. They stop seeing who we are." I reached for her hand. "Our family loves us." "They do," she answered. "But love needs tending, Bill, just like the garden." I remember laughing then because she always managed to compare life to growing tomatoes. Looking back now, I wish I had listened more carefully. Maybe she saw the cracks long before I did. Maybe she understood that respect rarely disappears all at once. It erodes quietly, almost politely, until one day someone feels comfortable making a joke they never would have made years before. Emma broke my thoughts by sliding her small hand into mine beneath the breakfast table. "Grandpa?" she whispered. "Are you sad?" I looked into her bright blue eyes that reminded me so much of Helen. "No," I lied gently. "Just remembering your grandmother. She liked your boots," Emma said. I smiled for real that time. She did. She told me once that they made you look strong. I swallowed the lump rising in my throat. "Your grandmother was a very smart woman," Emma grinned. "I think they look cool." Across the table, Lauren glanced at the boots again before looking toward the entrance of the dining room. Her expression suddenly stiffened, almost as if she had noticed someone unexpected walking inside. I followed her eyes without turning my head too quickly. 3 older members had just entered together, and one of them stopped for the briefest moment. He looked directly at me with the same puzzled expression I had seen earlier that morning, then quietly whispered something to the others. All 3 men turned toward our table at exactly the same time. The 3 men did not come over immediately. They simply stood near the entrance, speaking quietly among themselves while stealing another glance in my direction. Lauren noticed it too. "Do you know them?" she asked without looking at me. "They look familiar," I replied honestly. "I cannot remember from where." "They probably recognize Michael," she said. "A lot of people here know the attorneys from his firm." Michael shifted in his chair but said nothing. He had perfected that silence over the years, the kind that tried to keep peace while slowly feeding the very thing it feared. Breakfast continued, at least on the surface. Plates arrived. Coffee was refilled. Emma excitedly pointed toward the large windows whenever she spotted golfers driving across the first fairway. Yet something subtle had changed in the room. Every now and then, I caught another member looking my way before quickly turning back to their conversation. It was not admiration. It was curiosity, as if they were trying to solve a puzzle. Lauren finally stood. "I want to show Emma the clubhouse before everyone arrives for the fundraiser tonight." Emma looked at me. "Grandpa, are you coming?" Before I could answer, Lauren smiled politely. "Your grandfather probably wants to relax. There is a lot of walking." I looked down at my boots and smiled. "Actually, I have spent most of my life walking in these." Emma laughed. "See? I told you." Michael forced a smile. "Maybe we can all walk together." Lauren hesitated for just a second before nodding. "Fine." We stepped outside into the bright morning sun. The mountain air carried the scent of freshly cut grass, mixed with pine trees from the hills beyond the course. Golf carts rolled ackley along the paved paths, while groundskeepers prepared flower beds for the evening event. Emma skipped ahead, chasing butterflies near a small stone bridge. I slowed my pace. enjoying the peacefulness that only early mornings seemed able to preserve. Then Lauren stopped beside one of the bronze plaques mounted near the clubhouse entrance. "They really should update these," she said. Michael looked over. "Update what?" "These donor plaques. Half these names probably do not even belong to active members anymore." She pointed toward the engraved metal. "It makes the place look outdated." I glanced at the plaque without thinking much about it. It listed families who had contributed to community projects over several decades. Some names I recognized. Others belonged to people long gone. "History usually looks old," I said quietly. "That is kind of the point." Lauren smiled thinly. "History is nice, Bill. But successful places move forward." We continued walking until we reached the clubhouse garden, where volunteers were arranging tables beneath white tents. Workers unloaded flower arrangements, while electricians checked strings of lights that would glow after sunset. A young volunteer hurried past, carrying several framed photographs. One slipped from the stack and landed on the grass beside me. I bent down, picked it up, and brushed a little dirt from the frame before handing it back. "Thank you, sir," the young man said. He looked at me for a second longer than expected. "Have we met?" "I do not think so. You just seem familiar." Lauren let out a soft laugh after he walked away. "Apparently everybody thinks they know you today." "Strange morning," I admitted. "Maybe it is the boots," she replied. Michael shot her a warning look, but she ignored it. As we reached the terrace overlooking the 18th green, several club board members gathered around large presentation boards displaying plans for future renovations. One board showed sketches for a new youth learning center. Another featured expanded practice facilities for local high school students. Emma pointed excitedly. "Grandpa, look! They are building something for kids." I stepped closer to read the display. The headline caught my attention immediately. "Carter Family Community Learning Center." I stopped walking. My eyes rested on the words for several long seconds. Michael noticed. "Dad?" "Nothing," I answered softly. Lauren folded her arms. "I heard the Carter Foundation pledged another huge donation this year." One of the board members standing nearby overheard her comment and smiled proudly. "They have supported this community for decades." Lauren nodded with admiration. "People like that deserve recognition." She looked back toward me without realizing what she was really saying. "Not everyone leaves a meaningful legacy." Michael quietly whispered, "Lauren." "What?" she replied. "I am complimenting the donors." I looked once more at the architectural drawing before turning away. There was no bitterness inside me, only memories. Helen had loved those projects. She always believed children deserved safe places to learn regardless of how much money their parents earned. We had spent countless evenings around our kitchen table talking about scholarships, apprenticeships, libraries, and trade programs. She used to tell me, if one child finds a better future because someone believed in them, every dollar was worth it. Hearing Lauren praise the foundation without the slightest idea why those words touched me felt oddly surreal. Emma slipped her hand into mine again. "Grandpa?" "Yes, sweetheart? Do you know the Carter family?" I smiled gently. "A little. Are they nice?" Before I could answer, a familiar voice came from behind us. They were among the finest people I ever worked with. We all turned. The elderly gentleman who had been watching me since breakfast was standing only a few feet away now. His silver hair caught the sunlight, and his eyes remained fixed on my face rather than my clothes. He took another careful step closer, studying me with growing certainty. Then his expression changed completely. His eyebrows lifted, his eyes widened, and a slow smile spread across his face. "My goodness," he whispered almost to himself. "It cannot be." Lauren straightened politely, assuming he was about to greet one of the board members nearby. Instead, the gentleman ignored everyone else. He walked directly toward me, stopping close enough to see every crease in my weathered face. His voice trembled slightly as he asked one quiet question that instantly silenced everyone standing around us. "Are you William Carter?" For a moment, nobody spoke. Even the volunteers arranging flowers seemed to pause as the elderly gentleman stood in front of me with an expression somewhere between disbelief and relief. I looked at him carefully. His face had changed with age, his shoulders slightly bent, his hair almost completely white, but there was something unmistakably familiar about the way he smiled. Then it came back to me. Richard? I asked quietly. His eyes brightened. I knew it. I told them it had to be you. Before I could say another word, Richard Holloway reached forward and shook my hand with both of his. It has been nearly 20 years, Bill. I smiled. Closer to 25. He laughed. You always remembered the details better than I did. Lauren glanced toward Michael, obviously confused. You know each other? Richard turned to her politely. Know each other? Your father-in-law and I have worked together on community projects for longer than some of the people here have been alive. I could almost hear the silence settle across the terrace. Several board members who had been studying the renovation plans slowly drifted closer without pretending otherwise. Richard looked back at me. Why did you never tell anyone you were coming today? I shrugged. My son invited me for breakfast. That sounds exactly like something you would say. He laughed softly again before his expression grew warmer, still avoiding attention. Lauren folded her arms. I am sorry, but how do you know Bill? Richard looked genuinely surprised by the question. How do I know Bill? He glanced around as though expecting someone else to answer for him. When nobody did, he smiled. My dear, if this valley has enjoyed half the opportunities it has today, there is a good chance your father-in-law had something to do with them. Lauren forced a polite smile that did not quite hide her uncertainty. I thought the Carter Foundation handled most of those projects. Richard nodded. It did. He looked directly at her. Bill and Helen Carter created it. I lowered my eyes toward the stone walkway. I had never enjoyed hearing those words spoken aloud. Helen always believed good deeds should outlive the people who made them. That was why we kept our names off buildings whenever possible. Richard continued before I could interrupt him. The first scholarship fund started in their dining room. I remember sitting at that old oak table while Helen poured coffee and Bill argued that trade schools deserved the same respect as universities. One of the board members smiled. I have heard that story. Richard chuckled. Because it is true. Emma looked up at me with wide eyes. Grandpa, you never told me that. I squeezed her shoulder gently. It was never about telling people. Exactly, Richard said. That is why so few know the whole story. Michael stood quietly beside me, staring at the ground. His face carried an expression I had not seen since he was a little boy, who had forgotten his homework and hoped no one would notice. Richard noticed him too. You must be Michael. Yes, sir. Richard smiled warmly. Your father used to keep photographs of you in his office. Every Friday he found an excuse to show someone the newest one. Michael looked at me. You did? Parents do things like that. He swallowed before answering. I did not know. You were busy building your own life, I said. That is how it should be. Lauren remained unusually quiet. I could almost see her trying to fit this conversation into the picture she had already created in her mind. It did not fit. Nothing she was hearing belonged with the old truck, the faded flannel shirt, or the worn work boots she had laughed at earlier that morning. Richard gestured toward my boots with an amused smile. You still have those? I looked down. Different soles. Same boots? Same boots. Richard laughed loud enough for several nearby volunteers to hear. Helen used to tease you that those boots would outlive both of you. I smiled despite myself. She was probably right. The laughter spread naturally through the small group. It was gentle, affectionate, completely different from the laughter I had heard over breakfast. One came from mockery. The other came from shared memories. There was a world of difference between the two. A woman from the club board stepped forward. Judge Holloway, would you introduce us properly? Richard nodded without hesitation. Ladies and gentlemen, this is William Carter. If you have ever wondered why this community values apprenticeships, why hundreds of local students received scholarships without cameras present, or why this club's youth outreach survived during difficult years, you are looking at one of the people responsible. I immediately lifted a hand. Richard, that is enough. He looked at me kindly. No, Bill, it is not enough. It has never been enough. His voice softened. You spent your whole life making sure other people received credit first. The board members exchanged surprised glances. One older gentleman stepped closer. Mr. Carter, I remember my father talking about you. Another added quietly. Mine, too. Lauren shifted her weight uneasily. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed unsure of what to say. She looked toward the large donor display again, then back at me, then at Richard. If Bill helped create the foundation. She stopped herself. Richard finished the sentence for her. Then yes. The Carter on those plaques is this Carter. Nobody spoke after that. Even the breeze seemed quieter. Somewhere beyond the terrace, I heard golf clubs striking balls in steady rhythm. But on that patio, every conversation had faded away. Emma wrapped both arms around my hand and whispered proudly, "I knew Grandpa was special." I leaned down and kissed the top of her head. Every grandfather is special to someone. Before anyone could answer, a club employee hurried across the terrace carrying a folder. He stopped beside the board chair, whispered something urgently, and handed over several papers. The chair looked through them quickly before lifting his eyes toward me with visible surprise. Then he turned to Richard and said in a voice that everyone nearby could hear, "Judge Holloway, I think there is something all of you need to see before tonight's dinner begins." The board chair accepted the folder with both hands, but instead of opening it himself, he turned toward me. "Mr. Carter," he said gently, "would you mind stepping inside for just a moment?" I shook my head. "If this concerns the fundraiser, there is no need to involve me." Richard smiled knowingly. "Bill, I have known you long enough to recognize that look. You are already trying to disappear." A few people laughed quietly, not at me this time, but with a kind of affection that felt unfamiliar after the morning I had just lived through. The board chair opened the folder anyway. Inside were several yellowed photographs, protected by clear sleeves, copies of old newspaper articles, and a typed program for the evening gala. He carefully removed the first photograph and held it where everyone nearby could see. The image showed a muddy construction site from decades earlier. A group of workers stood around the concrete foundation of a half-finished community building. I recognized every face except my own. Time has a strange way of changing how you see yourself. "Is that you?" Emma asked, pointing toward a younger man wearing a hard hat and the same style of work boots I still wore. I nodded slowly. "I think I was about 38. Richard leaned closer to the picture. "That was the winter everyone said the project would fail because funding disappeared." Another board member added. "Yet somehow it was completed." Richard looked at me. "Would you like to tell them how?" I smiled faintly. "Not really. Then I will." He rested the photograph on the table. Most people believed the county rescued that project. They did not. Bill mortgaged part of his own business so the workers would continue receiving paychecks until new funding arrived. Lauren blinked. He mortgaged his company? "Temporarily," I answered before Richard could continue. "Everything worked out." Richard looked at me with the same patient expression Helen used to wear whenever she knew I was leaving out half the story. "You also refused reimbursement." I shrugged. Other people needed the money more. A younger volunteer quietly asked, "Why would someone do that?" Before I answered, another memory surfaced. I could almost smell fresh sawdust and wet cement. I remembered standing beside a 19-year-old apprentice named Daniel during that same project. He had just become a father and was terrified of losing his job. "Mr. Carter," he had said while loading lumber into the truck, "if work stops, I do not know how I will feed my little girl." I had looked at him and replied, "Then we are not stopping." I never thought much about that conversation afterward. It simply felt like the right thing to do. Richard interrupted my thoughts. "Daniel still lives in this county." He smiled toward one of the volunteers. "In fact, he is bringing his granddaughter to tonight's fundraiser." The young volunteer looked surprised. "My grandfather's name is Daniel." Richard nodded. "Then ask him who kept food on your family's table that winter." Silence settled over the group again. Nobody seemed interested in the architectural drawings anymore. The papers had become less important than the stories quietly emerging between them. Michael finally spoke. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Dad, why did you never tell me any of this?" I looked at him for a long moment. "Because you were busy becoming your own man. I did not want you spending your life walking in my shadow." His eyes glistened. "I never even knew there was a shadow." Lauren stared toward the photograph without saying anything. For the first time since I had met her, she seemed less interested in speaking than listening. The board chair carefully removed another document from the folder. It was a newspaper clipping, its edges faded from age. Across the top was a headline announcing the opening of a vocational scholarship program for local high school students. My name appeared nowhere on the page. Only the Carter Foundation was mentioned. Lauren frowned. "Why did they never print your name?" I answered simply, "Because I asked them not to." "But why?" Emma asked. "Would you not want people to know?" I smiled at my granddaughter. "Recognition feels nice for a day. Opportunity can change someone's whole life. I always preferred the second one." Richard quietly nodded. Helen used to say exactly the same thing. Hearing her name spoken aloud brought an ache that never truly disappeared. I could picture her sitting at our old kitchen table with a legal pad covered in handwritten notes, organizing scholarship applications while insisting that every student deserved to be judged by character rather than family income. We never imagined people would remember those evenings. We certainly never planned for anyone to talk about them decades later. One of the board members looked through the remaining papers before stopping at a sealed envelope clipped to the back of the file. "This was delivered only this morning," he said. "It came from the Foundation archives." Richard raised an eyebrow. "Archives?" Apparently an old storage room was being reorganized this week. He carefully turned the envelope over. Across the front, written in neat handwriting that instantly tightened my chest, were 6 simple words. "To be opened if William Carter attends." I knew that handwriting immediately. Helen. My heartbeat slowed as though time itself had stepped backward. That envelope had not been there by accident. I had watched Helen write hundreds of letters during our marriage, but I had never seen this one. Michael looked at me with confusion. "Dad, Mom wrote that?" I could only nod. Lauren finally spoke, her voice softer than I had ever heard it. How could she have known? Richard accepted the envelope carefully, almost reverently, then looked at me instead of opening it. "Bill," he said quietly, "I believe this belongs to you." Every conversation around us faded into silence as I reached toward the envelope with hands that suddenly felt much older than 68 years. My fingers rested on the envelope for several long seconds before I finally picked it up. The paper felt brittle, as though it had been waiting patiently for years. I traced Helen's handwriting with my thumb without breaking the seal. There were some things in life that deserved silence before words. Richard stepped back without saying anything. So did everyone else. Even Emma, who usually could not hide her curiosity, simply held my hand and waited. "Dad," Michael said softly, "you do not have to open it here." I looked at him and smiled. "If your mother wanted me to read it only if I came here, then I think she expected others to hear what she had to say." Richard nodded. "That sounds exactly like Helen." I carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. There was only one page. The handwriting was steady, each line unmistakably hers. "Dear Bill, if you are reading this, then somehow life has brought you back to this place. I hope you came wearing those old work boots because you were never ashamed of where they carried you." I had to stop reading for a moment. Emma squeezed my fingers. "Grandpa, I am all right." My voice came out quieter than I expected. I continued. "People will always notice polished shoes before they notice honest footsteps. Do not let that trouble you. You and I never built anything for applause. We built it so other families would have chances we never had. If someone judges you before learning your story, they have revealed something about themselves, not about you." I could almost hear Helen's voice speaking each sentence. Around me, no one moved. Lauren lowered her eyes. Michael stood with his hands folded tightly together. Richard quietly wiped one corner of his eye before pretending he had simply adjusted his glasses. The letter continued. "There is one favor I hope you will grant me. If the day ever comes when someone discovers who you are, please do not make them feel small for not knowing. The greatest lesson we can leave behind is kindness when pride would be easier." I folded the letter slowly. Nobody spoke for several moments. Finally, Emma looked up at me. Grandma was really smart. I laughed softly through the ache in my chest. She was smarter than I ever was. Richard looked toward the board members. I believe all of us just received the same lesson. One of the younger volunteers nodded quietly. I have never heard anyone write something like that. Lauren finally took a slow breath. "Bill." She hesitated, searching for words that seemed much harder to find than they had been that morning. I did not know." I looked at her calmly. "No, You did not. If I had. She stopped again. If I had known. I gently shook my head before she finished. Then nothing important would have changed. She frowned in confusion. What do you mean? I glanced down at my boots. If respect only appears after people learn your accomplishments, it is not really respect. It is admiration for success. Those are different things. Nobody interrupted. Even Richard remained silent, allowing the words to settle naturally. Michael finally stepped closer. Dad, I should have said something this morning. Perhaps. I kept hoping things would smooth themselves over. Sometimes silence protects peace, I replied. Other times it protects the wrong things. His shoulders lowered. I understand that now. I placed a hand on his shoulder. Understanding is enough for today. The board chair carefully gathered the old photographs and newspaper articles back into the folder. Mr. Carter, he said respectfully, would you allow us to display these tonight? Many members have never heard the full history behind the foundation. I thought about it for a moment before answering. Display the history. Leave my name off the signs. Several people exchanged surprised smiles. Richard laughed quietly. You have not changed at all. Neither have the reasons. A voice from behind us interrupted the conversation. Judge Holloway? Everyone turned. The club manager approached carrying a tablet and several printed seating charts. We have a small situation. What happened? Richard asked. She looked uncertain for a moment before answering. When word started spreading that Mr. Carter was here, several longtime members requested changes to tonight's seating arrangements. Lauren looked puzzled. Changes? The manager nodded. Quite a few guests specifically asked to sit near him. Lauren stared at me in complete disbelief. Only a few hours earlier, she had been worried that my boots would embarrass the family. Now, people were asking to rearrange an entire gala just to share a table with me. I could almost see the conflict unfolding behind her eyes. Pride struggled against regret. Habit struggled against humility. Emma smiled proudly. See? Everybody likes Grandpa. I knelt beside her. Not everybody, sweetheart. They will. I smiled. Maybe. Richard looked toward the manager. Tell them Bill will sit wherever there is an empty chair. Even if it is at the back? She asked. Especially if it is at the back, I answered. The manager laughed warmly before walking away to adjust the seating charts once again. Lauren watched her leave, then quietly turned back toward me. Bill. She began again. Would you let me ask you something? Of course. Why did you never correct me? I looked across the golf course where a groundskeeper was patiently repairing a small section of turf that most people would never notice. Because people eventually reveal who they are when you give them enough time. She lowered her eyes. And what did I reveal? I did not answer immediately. Helen's letter remained folded inside my jacket pocket, resting close to my heart. That, I said gently, is something only you can decide. Before Lauren could respond, another black sedan slowly pulled into the circular driveway near the clubhouse entrance. Richard glanced toward it, and his expression changed immediately. He straightened his jacket almost instinctively. Well, he said quietly, I did not expect him to come in person. The rear door opened, and every board member standing nearby suddenly turned toward the arriving guest with unmistakable respect. The man who stepped out of the sedan was in his early 70s, tall, neatly dressed in a navy suit that looked elegant without trying too hard. His silver hair caught the afternoon sunlight as he buttoned his jacket and thanked the driver before walking toward the clubhouse. I recognized him almost immediately. Thomas Grayson. He had spent decades leading one of the largest manufacturing companies in western Montana before retiring. More importantly, he had quietly become one of the most respected civic leaders in the region. Richard smiled as Thomas approached. I had no idea you were coming today. Thomas shook Richard's hand, but his eyes were already searching the group. The moment they found me, his face softened. Bill. He crossed the remaining distance without hesitation and extended both hands. It has been far too long. It certainly has, I replied. You are looking well. He laughed. That makes one of us. A few board members smiled politely, but the surprise on their faces was impossible to miss. Thomas Grayson rarely attended club functions before the evening gala. For him to arrive hours early was unusual, I heard a rumor, Thomas said. I was hoping it was true. Rumors have a way of growing. Not this one. He glanced down at my boots and grinned. You still refuse to buy new ones. The old ones have not complained yet. Neither have I. The easy conversation between us drew more people toward the terrace. Some recognized Thomas immediately. Others seemed more interested in understanding why a man of his reputation was treating me like an old friend. Lauren stood quietly beside Michael. I noticed her watching every exchange, almost as though she were trying to rebuild her understanding of the last several years, one memory at a time. Thomas turned toward the board chair. Have you shown Bill the plans? Yes. Good. He nodded approvingly. The learning center would never exist without the foundation. Lauren finally asked the question that had clearly been sitting in her mind all morning. Mr. Grayson, may I ask something? Thomas smiled warmly. Of course. Did you work with Bill too? For nearly 30 years. She looked genuinely confused. I thought Bill owned a construction company. Thomas chuckled. He did. Then how? Because building a community requires more than concrete. His answer lingered in the quiet air. He continued walking slowly beside me toward the display boards, while everyone naturally followed. Do you remember the apprenticeship council? He asked. Barely, I replied. That was your idea, Thomas reminded me. Mine? You walked into my office carrying a notebook full of names. I smiled as the memory slowly returned. Young men and women looking for work. Exactly. Thomas looked toward the others. Bill convinced local businesses to train high school graduates, instead of waiting for experienced workers to magically appear. Hundreds of careers started because he refused to accept that talent should be wasted. One of the younger volunteers spoke up. My father always talks about an apprenticeship program that changed his life. Thomas nodded. Ask him who organized the first one. I looked away toward the golf course. Praise had always made me uncomfortable. Helen used to tease me about that. She would say, one day people will tell your stories whether you like it or not. I always answered the same way. Then I hope they remember yours first. Emma tugged gently on my sleeve. Grandpa, were you really that busy? I laughed softly. I mostly filled out paperwork and drank too much coffee. Thomas laughed louder than anyone else. That is the version Bill tells. The truth usually sounds different. Lauren slowly turned toward Michael. Her voice was low enough that only those closest could hear. Did you know any of this? Michael stared at the ground before answering. No. Not even a little? No. She looked at him with surprise. He is your father. Michael nodded painfully. I know. Richard quietly stepped closer. Sometimes children only see the parent who comes home tired at night. They do not see the thousands of decisions made before dinner. Michael closed his eyes briefly. I always thought Dad liked staying in the background. I answered gently. I did. Why? He asked. Because somebody else always needed the spotlight more than I did. Lauren folded her arms, but not defensively this time. She seemed to be protecting herself from something much heavier than embarrassment. I judged you without asking a single question, she admitted quietly. I looked at her for a moment before replying. Most people do that at least once in their lives. But I kept doing it. Yes. She nodded slowly, accepting the answer instead of arguing with it. Nearby, two longtime club members who had been listening to the conversation began speaking quietly with one another. One shook his head. I told you this morning there had to be more to the story. The other replied, You also laughed when someone mentioned the boots. I know, we all did. Their conversation spread naturally. Small groups formed across the terrace. People who had arrived expecting nothing more than a pleasant Saturday suddenly found themselves exchanging stories they had heard from parents, grandparents, former coworkers, and retired teachers. Piece by piece, a picture of my past emerged without my having to describe it myself. What surprised me most was not how much they remembered. It was how differently they remembered it. One recalled a scholarship. Another remembered a bridge project. Someone else spoke about a trade program. None of them described the same event, yet together they painted a life I had never intended anyone to assemble. Richard quietly leaned toward me. Do you see what is happening? People are talking. No. He smiled. The truth is no longer depending on you. I understood exactly what he meant. For years, I had assumed my story would disappear with me because I had never told it. Instead, fragments of it had survived inside hundreds of other lives. They belonged to welders, teachers, nurses, electricians, business owners, and families I barely remembered helping. It was never my story alone. Suddenly, the board chair received another call on his phone. He listened for several moments before looking up with visible surprise. "They have already arrived?" he asked. He ended the call and walked quickly toward Richard. "There is another development." Richard frowned. "What now?" The board chair lowered his voice, but everyone standing nearby could still hear the excitement in it. "The trustees from the Carter Foundation just arrived for the gala." He paused before adding the part that made every conversation on the terrace stop at once. "They are asking to meet privately with Mr. Bayadabai, Carter, before anyone else enters the ballroom." I looked at Richard before answering the board chair. If the trustees came all this way, I suppose I should not keep them waiting. He smiled. "They have been waiting much longer than today, Bill." We walked through a quiet hallway toward one of the smaller conference rooms overlooking the golf course. The afternoon sun stretched across the fairway, casting long shadows over the grass. It reminded me of evenings when Helen and I would sit on our porch without saying much, believing that peace rarely needed conversation. The conference room door stood open. 5 men and women rose from their seats as I entered. Some of them I recognized immediately. Others had grown older than I remembered. Every one of them greeted me the same way, not with applause or ceremony, but with the warmth of old friends. "Mr. Carter," one of them said, extending his hand. "It is good to finally see you again." "Please," I replied with a smile. "Bill is more than enough." We sat together around the table. A pot of coffee rested in the middle beside a small plate of oatmeal cookies. I smiled when I noticed them. "Helen's recipe," one of the trustees said. "We still make them every year for the scholarship interviews." I picked one up carefully. The smell alone carried me back decades. Helen always baked the night before those interviews because she believed nervous students deserved something that reminded them of home. One trustee, a retired school principal named Eleanor Brooks, slid a folder across the table. "Bill, we have something we wanted to discuss with you before tonight." I looked at the folder, but did not open it. "Go ahead." Over the past year, we have received dozens of letters from former scholarship recipients. Many of them are now teachers, engineers, nurses, veterans, business owners, and parents themselves. They all ask the same question. She smiled gently. "Why has no one ever told them who started all of this?" I leaned back quietly. "Because that was never the point." "Perhaps not then," Eleanor replied. "But today is different." Another trustee nodded. "Young people need examples they can believe in. They need to know that success is not always loud." I thought about Helen's letter resting safely inside my jacket pocket. Her words echoed in my mind. "Do not make them feel small." I looked around the room before answering. "If you tell my story, promise me you tell Helen's first." Eleanor smiled through tears. "We already do." There was a gentle knock at the open door. Emma peeked inside, followed by Michael and Lauren. "May we come in?" Michael asked quietly. I looked toward the trustees. They all nodded before I answered. "Of course." Emma hurried over and climbed into the chair beside mine. "Grandpa, everybody outside keeps talking about you." I laughed softly. "That will not last forever." "Maybe not," she replied. "But I think they are talking because they are thankful. Children sometimes understand things adults spend years trying to explain." Lauren remained standing for a moment before slowly walking toward me. She looked different than she had that morning. Not because of her clothes or her posture. Something inside her had become quieter. "Bill," she said softly, "I owe you an apology." I shook my head gently. "You owe yourself honesty first." She nodded. "Then let me start there. I spent years believing that appearance told me everything I needed to know about a person. Today I realized it only told me what I wanted to believe." She paused before continuing. "When I laughed at your boots, I was really showing everyone my own blindness." No one interrupted her. She looked directly into my eyes. "I cannot change this morning, but I hope I can change tomorrow." I smiled kindly. "That is all any of us can do." Michael stepped closer. "Dad, I also need to say something." "You do not have to." "Yes, I do." He took a slow breath. I confused keeping peace with avoiding difficult conversations. Every time I stayed quiet, I thought I was protecting my family. I see now that silence can leave good people standing alone. I placed my hand on his shoulder. Then teach Emma something different. He nodded. I will. Emma looked from her parents to me. Does this mean everybody is friends again? The room filled with gentle laughter. Families are not perfect, I told her. They are simply given many chances to choose kindness again. She smiled as though that answer made perfect sense. One of the trustees reached into another folder and handed Emma a small bronze pin shaped like an oak tree. Every student who receives a Carter Foundation scholarship gets one of these, she explained. Emma looked at me. Why an oak tree? I answered before anyone else could. Because oak trees spend many years growing roots before people admire their branches. Emma carefully pinned it onto her sweater. Then I want deep roots too. I felt my eyes sting for the second time that day. Helen would have loved hearing that. As evening settled over the country club, guests slowly gathered for the fundraiser. The ballroom lights reflected softly against polished wood floors, while conversations filled the room with quiet warmth. People came over to shake my hand, but what stayed with me was not their admiration. It was the stories they shared. One man told me his mother had become the first nurse in their family because of a scholarship. Another woman said her father often spoke about a contractor who treated every apprentice with dignity. None of them were really thanking me. They were thanking the people who had believed in them before they believed in themselves. Later that evening, after dinner had ended and the guests began drifting toward their cars, I stepped outside onto the terrace one last time. The air had turned cool, and the mountains stood quietly beneath a sky full of stars. Emma slipped her small hand into mine exactly as she had done that morning. Grandpa? Yes, sweetheart? Are you going to buy new boots now? I looked down at the old leather, worn smooth by decades of honest work. I smiled and shook my head. No, why not? I looked across the dark fairway before answering, because these boots remind me where I have been. But the people I love remind me where I am going. Emma rested her head against my arm, and together we stood there in comfortable silence. As we walked toward the parking lot, I noticed my old pickup waiting exactly where I had left it that morning. Nothing about it had changed. Neither had the boots beneath my feet. The only thing that had changed was the weight I had been carrying inside my heart. I finally understood that respect earned through titles, wealth, or applause eventually fades. But a life built with quiet integrity continues walking long after the footsteps disappear. And if there is one lesson I hope my granddaughter carries farther than I ever could, it is this. Never judge a person by the shine on their shoes. Pay attention instead to the road they chose to walk, and to how many others reached a better place because they walked beside them. 3 months passed before I returned to the country club, not because anyone invited me back, and not because I felt I had something left to prove. I came because Emma had asked if we could feed the koi fish together before school started again. Some promises deserve to become traditions. The morning air carried the first hint of autumn. Leaves drifted lazily across the walking paths, and the mountains beyond the valley wore a little more gold than green. My old pickup sounded exactly the same when I turned off the engine. My boots looked exactly the same when they touched the gravel. Only the man wearing them had changed. Emma came running across the front lawn the moment she saw me. "Grandpa!" she shouted, throwing her arms around my waist. "You came early. I wanted to beat you to the fish." She laughed. "Impossible. They know I bring the food." We walked slowly toward the pond, carrying a small paper bag filled with fish pellets. The water rippled gently beneath the morning sun, as dozens of bright orange koi surfaced, waiting patiently. Emma tossed in the first handful. "Grandpa?" "Yes?" Mom cries sometimes now. I looked at her carefully. "Does she?" Emma nodded. Not because she is sad all the time. Sometimes because she says she wishes she had listened more. I watched another circle spread across the water before answering. Regret can become a very good teacher if we let it. Emma seemed satisfied with that answer. Children often accept truths adults spend years arguing with. Later that morning, Lauren found us sitting on a wooden bench overlooking the pond. She carried 2 paper cups of coffee. She handed one to me before sitting down beside us. "I remembered how you take it," she said quietly. "Black. No sugar." I smiled. "You remembered." I should have remembered more things sooner. For a while, we simply watched the fish swim beneath the surface. There was no awkwardness left, only honesty. Lauren finally spoke again. I have been volunteering with the scholarship committee. I turned toward her with quiet surprise. Really? She nodded. I wanted to understand what the foundation actually does instead of only knowing its name. She smiled faintly. Last week, I interviewed a young woman whose father works construction. She looked down at her hands. I almost cried when she talked about how proud she was of his boots. Neither of us said anything for a moment. The silence felt peaceful instead of heavy. Bill, she continued softly, thank you for giving me the chance to become someone better instead of making me pay for being someone worse. I thought about Helen's letter resting safely inside the small wooden box where I now kept my most important memories. That was never my gift, I replied. It was Helen's. Lauren nodded slowly. I think I understand that now. Michael joined us a few minutes later carrying a worn notebook. Dad, I wanted to show you something. He opened it carefully. Inside were handwritten notes about a mentorship program his law firm had started for first-generation college students and young tradespeople who wanted legal guidance before opening their own businesses. We named it the Helen Carter Mentorship Initiative, he said quietly. I looked up at him. You did not have to do that. I wanted Emma to grow up knowing her grandmother's name for the right reasons. My throat tightened. She would have liked that. I hope so. She would have loved it. Richard Holloway stopped by before lunch. Retirement had not slowed him much, although he insisted it had. We laughed about old stories, argued over whose memory was worse, and spent 10 minutes debating whether my boots were finally ready to retire. They are antiques now, Richard joked. That makes them valuable. Then I should leave them to Emma, only if she promises not to polish them. Emma overheard us and smiled. I would never polish Grandpa's boots. We all laughed together. It was a simple moment, but I realized simple moments are usually the ones people remember longest. As the months continued, life settled into a quieter rhythm. Michael visited more often, sometimes alone, sometimes with his family. We rebuilt our relationship one conversation at a time instead of pretending the distance had never existed. Lauren stopped trying to impress everyone around her. Instead, she began asking questions, listening more than speaking, and discovering that genuine respect grows slowly, much like the oak trees Helen loved so much. The Community Learning Center eventually opened the following spring. At the dedication ceremony, the trustees once again offered to place my name above the entrance. I thanked them kindly and declined. Instead, a small bronze plaque near the front garden carried a simple sentence chosen from Helen's letter. People will always notice polished shoes before they notice honest footsteps. Do not let that trouble you. Those words belonged exactly where young people could read them before walking inside. A few weeks after the opening, Emma asked if we could plant an oak tree beside the building. We spent the afternoon digging together. My knees complained more than they used to, and Emma laughed every time I stopped to catch my breath. Grandpa, she said while brushing dirt from her gloves, this tree is tiny. So are most good beginnings. We placed the young oak into the ground together and covered its roots carefully. Before leaving, Emma pressed one of her small hands against the slender trunk. Do you think it will still be here when I am old? If people care for it, I answered. It will probably outlive both of us. She smiled. Then I will make sure someone always does. As we walked back toward my truck, I looked down at the old boots that had traveled with me through construction sites, hospital hallways, funeral homes, quiet mornings, and unexpected forgiveness. They had never made me important. They had simply carried me toward the people who mattered most. That evening, after everyone had gone home, I sat alone on my back porch with Helen's letter resting in my hands. The sun slipped slowly behind the mountains, painting the sky with the same colors we used to watch together. Beside my chair stood a small wooden box holding the letter, the bronze oak pin Emma had insisted I keep until she was older, and a photograph of our family taken just a few weeks earlier. Nobody in the picture looked perfect. We simply looked together. I realized then that peace is not the absence of painful memories. Peace is knowing those memories no longer decide who you become. Before we part, I want to say something to anyone listening who has ever felt overlooked, judged, or quietly pushed aside by the people they loved. Do not let another person's opinion become the measure of your worth. Protect your self-respect without hardening your heart. Set healthy boundaries without giving up on kindness. Stay independent enough that your dignity never depends on someone else's approval. And remember that trust should always be earned through actions, not appearances. If this story touched your heart, I hope you will consider leaving a like, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your stories remind people that none of us walks through life alone. The lesson I carried home is simple. Character always outlasts appearances. Thank you for spending this time with me and allowing this memory to become part of your day. I hope it encourages you to look a little deeper, forgive a little wiser, and treasure the people whose quiet goodness often goes unnoticed. Until we meet again in another story, may your path be steady, your heart remain kind, and may you always recognize the value of honest footsteps, whether they are wrapped in polished shoes or worn old work boots.